Hey everyone. So today I just want to talk about the education proposal we had that was trying to help with education resources, which is a Fund 5 proposal we've been funded for recently and that we've been making some progress on. So we're just going to go through why resources are important, what we've kind of done so far, comparing some tooling that we've been looking at to try and solve some of the issues we've been seeing, and then recommend a solution. And then hopefully at the end, we'll get some of your feedback. So stay to the end and then, yeah, it's a little demo and we'll take it from there. So moving on. So first of all, why are education resources so important? So resources basically are going to help to educate people about the Project Catalyst ecosystem. And as we all know, Catalyst is complex. So documentation, because of that, becomes quite highly valuable. It would be really valuable for anyone in the community to be able to read or find out from whether it's media or written documentation to really understand what the ecosystem is all about and how it all works. And another factor that makes it even more important, documentation and kind of resources as a whole, is the rate of change. So Catalyst doesn't really change, the processes and tools don't really change every week. So it's not absolutely hectic and impossible to manage the resources, but it also doesn't change really slowly, like once a quarter. There's usually something changing with a role or a tool or something that's core to the ecosystem on a fairly regular kind of basis, let's say around once a month. And because of that, it actually makes it really, really important for that to be maintained, because it's very, very easy as a result to become out of date with exactly what's going on in the ecosystem and how everything works and all fits together. So moving on from that, having quality resources in a single location, like what would be the benefit of us kind of trying to achieve that? So the first main thing would be clarity and simplicity. So if all the resources are in a single place, it'd be much easier to find and track the different information as it kind of changes and just maintained as a whole. And if you have it all in that kind of one location, it becomes a lot clearer to understand the ecosystem, because then you can go from one role as I'm a proposer, but it's interesting to see how the community advisors work. So if I can easily see that kind of information as a whole, then I can collectively kind of understand how the ecosystem works. Then the second benefit is simple management. So a simple system will allow it to be much easier to update that information from whoever's kind of working on those processes and tools. So at the moment, it's mostly IOHK, but as that becomes more of the community, if they know that when something changes and the community's approved that, then it's good for them to know also that this is where they should update your documentation to say this is the new kind of change for this process or tooling. So by having it in a single place, that management becomes a lot more simple. Third thing is consistency. By always kind of keeping it consistent in that kind of place, in that location, that URL, then it just reduces confusion. I can send you a link, and as long as you have that link, whenever you go to it, whether it's now or in a few weeks, you know that you're going to get to the most up-to-date kind of information to do with the Catalyst ecosystem from that link. And I don't need to worry about that link or that resource becoming out of date, because that is the location where it gets maintained. And if it does get maintained, it's reflected on the interface that I'm looking at. So because of that, it becomes a lot easier to share it around, because you have that kind of consistency and reliability that you know what happens with that kind of resource. The final thing is it's the translation. So if you have a strong base of information and documentation, it's going to make it a lot easier to do translations for that. So at the moment, there's mainly English documentation, but as that kind of changes over time, I would imagine it's going to be a lot more important for us to put the effort into making sure those are translated into different languages, so more and more people can easily get involved. So that's some of the key kind of reasons why we want to make better education resource management, and then some of the reasons why you want to do it in a single place as well. So if we look into the current process, currently we have it so input, output. We've historically made a few like Google Docs resources. They have a few things on idea scale information. There's a few things in Zendesk. Occasionally there's been like voter registration in Reddit. And when they make those changes to the ecosystem and updates, they're generally sharing it with communication methods such as email and the subscriber list, in Telegram, and also sometimes obviously in the town hall we're sharing out as well. And then that information then eventually propagates to the community and also eventually the community tools. The key kind of problem with that at the moment is there's no single resource location, so it's difficult to track information and updates. The social posts, messages, and emails, if there's information in them, then they can easily get lost over time, because it just goes into the history of that time, that feed. So it's really bad for information management, kind of putting things on those kind of time-based feeds. Now, looking over at kind of where we are, we've kind of looked across the whole ecosystem and kind of gathered all those resources together that we could find, looked through historically the different kind of YouTube docs and everything that we could get our hands on, and collated that into a resource page. Now, you can find a link there with all the resource we found, and then obviously the subset is on our site for the things that are most useful. Now, the kind of lessons we learned from that is it's a bit of a follow the leader problem, where we're not really solving the crux of the issue, because when those resources are getting updated or changed by IOHK, we're kind of like frantically kind of chasing to make sure we maintain and update those kind of informations, but there isn't really like this kind of joint effort to maintain it and to keep some consistency in how it's all kind of dealt with. So although there is some use case and benefits to what we've done, it doesn't really solve the underlying issues that we need to make this a more distributed process and just a lot more streamlined and more efficient, because at the end of the day, whenever they post a resource, it actually duplicates some work by me then having to update another place to then reflect that kind of change. So if we look at the current governance process, this kind of helps to show what's kind of going on at the moment. So at the moment, IOHK kind of is custodian of the Catalyst process. And for these education resources, they're making changes, doing the updates, and then kind of pushing that out. So the team within IOHK will make the change, document it, and then share it to the community. And then for the community tools, they'll often need to update their own things to reflect those changes. So the key problems for this are the community tools often have to constantly update their information. There's a lack of consistency for how IOHK hosts that documentation. So we're constantly kind of trying to find where that new information has come from if we've not seen an update post, for instance. There's this fragmented effort between IOHK and the community on maintaining the resources. And collectively, we're not really effectively learning about the requirements for managing these resources in a distributed way. It's kind of very siloed efforts. There's not this kind of collective hive of intelligence to kind of understand what the key, how is this working? How should it be governed? What's the tools that we need? How should it be financed? And now, if we compare that with a potential other solution, which could be to endorse a community solution, that would entail a community solution being selected by IOHK. And then the IOHK team would need to also work with that solution to update the information, because they are still custodians, at least for the short to medium term, until Voltaire hits. And then other community tools with that approach would then need to consume that information from the selected community solution. As it stands at the moment, the kind of problems with that would be there's a risk of a malicious actor or execution risk when giving control to a small team in the community. There's a need for some permissions. So IOHK would need to be able to update the resources easily and have the functionality for that. And then community solutions at the moment would currently lack the needed features and have stability risks to kind of support what's needed. So that would be another concern with kind of just throwing this level of important resource control over to the community right now. If we have a look at the Catalyst Circle, that is a really good example of where we've started to explore this kind of distributed governance. So at the moment, we're allowing both IOHK and the community to learn together about how we could kind of governance the overall kind of overarching problems that Catalyst is having, and what processes are needed to effectively identify, address, and eventually produce solutions to those kind of problem sets. And a key benefit to this kind of approach is that IOHK endorses the Catalyst Circle and promotes the process, resulting in faster adoption of the process, and also keeps the community well informed because they constantly advertise it. Now, if you apply that kind of mindset to the resources, then this could also be achieved. So you could also have it so both IOHK and community manage the resources using the same tool. And then other community tools would use the information from that shared resource tool in any way they like. The key benefits to this kind of approach would be a much lower risk, because IOHK could keep full control of that tool in the short term, but then gradually release over time. So introduce, one trusted community member or two or three, or they could do it also really fast. It's completely up to them. So that completely lowers the risk for that. The second benefit is this combined learning. So if you can share the responsibility between the IOHK and the community, then it's going to help us to better understand what are the actual requirements of managing these resources. How often are they actually changing? Like, what kind of governance is needed, or what's the budgeting that's needed. By working on that together, it's going to help to inform a much better solution in the long term. And then finally, the other key benefit is because IOHK can initially control it, and they have a much more say on it, they can regularly endorse it, which will help that kind of growth to speed up the adoption, so people are using it as a reliable source. And it will also, because of that, tighten the feedback loop. So if everyone knows that's the kind of place to go, then they can start providing feedback on the things that aren't maybe up to standard, and constantly kind of provide that feedback loop for improving certain bits of documentation and resources that aren't up to scratch, or perhaps someone's missed and needs updating. So this would be a really good place, I think, to get to. So if we break that down, there's kind of three main areas that you could look at for what you kind of need to think about this resource management side. So there's the tools, governance, and budgeting. And by tools, what this means is it's just what we're using, what's the technical infrastructure we're using to actually manage the resources, to do the editing and updating, and just actually submitting those kind of changes, the information management. And then on top of that is like, how are you actually managing that tool? What's the governance of it? Like, once you've kind of picked a tool, what's the best ways to govern it? Does it need 2-3 people? Does it need 7-8 people? Like, what makes sense to actually keep it up to date and make sure that's constantly kind of valuable for the ecosystem? And also that obviously over time distribute the management as well. That's another important aspect. And then finally, once you kind of start learning about both of those kind of factors, what makes sense for tools and governance, you can also start playing around with budgeting. So whether that's bounties or part-time work, like how are we going to finance this resource management for Catalyst ecosystem? So it's finance enough, but not overcompensated. And what is that kind of correct kind of process and model to use to make sure it's done to a high enough quality? So for moving on from this, we're just going to really focus on the tools part, because that's really the starting point for how we can start to work together and try and decide whether we need to use an existing solution or some custom one to then lead to this kind of thinking about the governance and budgeting. So if we look at what the tool requirements we think that have, there's 5 that kind of stood out to us when we were kind of thinking about it. And the starting point would be editing interface. So it should be friendly to a non-developer, so that it shouldn't require pull requests to make changes to the resources. It should also support nested structure, formatting, and media. And by that we mean, so nested documents is kind of having documents as child. So in Notion, you might have, if you've used that before, you can have a document and then have a child document that's kind of a subset of the original one. So you can have this kind of nested structure, so it allows you to kind of structure things in a more effective way. Formatting, we just mean like text formatting, like headings, bullet points, and the rest. With some styling. And then finally, it should be able to handle some sort of media, so embedding YouTube's images, that kind of side. So that's just kind of all to do with like the structure and formatting and what you're adding to the documents. The third kind of requirement would be open source. So ideally, we should be able to fork the code and copy any of the data really easily. And ideally, we'd like to avoid any data in centralized databases, so that people can't just, if for whatever reason there's a malicious actor, that they couldn't just cut off access to people because it's in some centralized spaces, and all they've got to change is like the access control of who has permissions to kind of see it, and just turn something from public to private. The fourth area that would be really beneficial in requirements is translation. So as the resource set gets more formalized and a stronger base, and people are starting to rely on that, you have a better base in which you can start to do translations, and that's really going to benefit that kind of growth in the community across the different countries. And then the final concern for requirements would be having multiple contributors and permissions. So ideally, both IOHK and the community should be able to manage resources together, and with multiple contributors, with any kind of random amount, whether it's 2, 3, or even 5 to 10, and also have some sort of like simple permission there, just so in its initial instance we have some sort of control of who can update those resources, and that can be kind of managed in the short term. So to address these kind of requirements, we've been looking at different tools and what we've got so far and what's kind of happened. And we've kind of looked across some documentation tools. So Notion and Google, which you probably have heard of. There's some more kind of SaaS related tools that are popular in businesses, Confluence, Tetra. There's Git-based documentation, which means all of the data for those resources is hosted on GitHub, which is great because you can obviously have that all open source. So Gitbook, GitHub Pages. And then we've been looking at types of CMS systems. So you've got API-based CMS and Git-based CMS. So Git can obviously achieve the same thing, where it's kind of open source, and the API ones obviously in the centralized kind of database. both of those, the CMS options can be quite powerful. The custom solution is kind of the final thing, so we can obviously develop it all ourselves, and that's another option. After looking at all of these kind of tools, we kind of found that for the CMS options, they were fairly good for the editing interface, translation, most of them could do that, and also having the multiple collaborators and permissions. But what they're bad for is presenting the information without developing some sort of front-end website for that, and then usage of that tool as like an all-in-one documentation tool. Often, because they're more kind of catered for as a management system for a single website, they often came with a bit of bloat and added complexity that was not really needed. So because of that, both the Git-based and API CMS systems were a bit less ideal for the use cases that we had. And with that in mind, we then compared some of the top solutions and ideas that we could approach this. So as a custom community developed solution, that's obviously possible, but with anything, that's going to take time. So it could be open source from day one, so that can be ticked off straight away. But for all this extra kind of functionality that's going to be needed, that would be useful for maintaining this information and working with it, doing the distributed governance and that kind of side of it, and starting that off, all of those would require time. For the other three potential solutions, for editing interface, all of them could do that nice and easily and had a very clear kind of easy way to update it and maintain it. It was non-developer friendly. That was great. For the nested structure one, so both Notion and Gitbook were really good for that. So you can have groupings and sections and kind of nest it down so you can have that right level of granularity. And obviously you could do the media inserts as well, and also the styling, headings, and different types of text formatting. With Google Docs, you could do all the media stuff and the text formatting and all of that, but it's not so good for the nested structure. So if you want to have like a nested child document, you actually have to link really from a Google Docs document to another one. So it doesn't really have that, which just takes you to another tab, another link. It doesn't really offer that kind of nested structure kind of experience that would be ideal for the complexity that the Catalyst resources would require. For the open source kind of requirement, we have both Notion and Google Docs, as obviously the data would be on this kind of public site. So you could copy the data. So in some sense you have that, but it's still the data's in a centralized database. So this runs the risk of this, if there's communities that help managing that, if the permissions change and they have too much control, then there's potential for malicious activity to happen there, which is something we'd like to prevent. Whereas with Gitbooks, that's all based on Git. So you can have an open source repository. You can fork that repository, meaning both obviously the data is free on the interface, so you can see it from there, but you also have that kind of people can make automation and have that open source repository that they can also put pull requests into, fork, and kind of deal with how they like. So that's great one for that. For the translations, Notion doesn't support anything like that at the moment. For Google Docs, you can translate a doc, but what it will do is use Google Translate in the background and make a new Google page, which is not the perfect experience we'd want, because then that's another document. And then when you combine that with the nested structure issue as well above, where you're going to have multiple links to links, then suddenly you're going to have a lot of different links to links kind of to different documents, and it's not going to provide that kind of easy experience for moving from one translation document to the other. And then for Gitbooks, they support variants. So the first branch you can have could be English, but then you can have as many variants as you want that would then take the original branch in English and then put it into this new variant. And then you could update those variants to then reflect the translations into different languages. So you could do that in stages. That's the really good thing about it, is it's nice and easy to change between the translations, but then you could also kind of, do the core documentation in that, but then leave some of the other ones still in English and do that over time. So it could be nice and progressive over time, basically. And then for the final one, we have multiple contributors and permissions. So all of the different solutions had some sort of solution for that, and you could have as many people as you wanted to involve in it, and it had some sort of basic permissions. So they all kind of check the box on that one. So with that in mind, one of the suggested solutions from our point of view would be Gitbooks is looking like a really strong solution. So when we compared it to thinking about a custom solution for documentation isn't really kind of essential right now, because documentation as a problem for Catalyst isn't really the highest kind of point of concern, and something that the Catalyst ecosystem needs to excel at to kind of reach its potential. It's more to do with the governance, the auditing, and all of the process of going through that proposal, funding, and governance process, and making tooling and everything around that, that's really going to move the needle for making Catalyst better. Whereas how we host documentation and manage that, in its early instance is not like a critical thing that needs to spend a lot of resources to make a new custom solution for it. So that's a factor towards this. And then another thing is it's available immediately. We can start using it now. It's fairly low risk because IOHK can fully manage it in the short term. And then it has permission control, so they can gradually release that over time. It's completely production ready, so you'll see lots of different protocols and crypto projects, as well as anywhere else across the different industries using Gitbook. So very reliable and stable. It's, as mentioned before, it's a really good open source solution because people can fork it, make pull requests into it. There's obviously people who can be part of the managing of it. It's going to be a really good solution to prevent any kind of malicious actors and that side of it. It's also a lot easier to integrate as well. So people would have the full choice of whether they just want to link to the Gitbooks. They could embed the Gitbooks as a page in their own website, or they could actually pass, because it's all stored in markdown files on Gitbook. You could pass the markdown files and then decide how to render that how you like. So it actually provides a lot more options for the existing community tools to integrate that. And as well as that, you can actually automate it a lot easier as well. Oh, sorry about that. Where are we? Yeah, there we are. So it's a lot easier to integrate, basically. And with the automation as well, that is a real big plus, because then you can just use continuous integration to something changes in the Gitbook, and then you can automatically kind of pull that into your own website and then decide what you want to do with it. So it kind of takes out that kind of all that manual labor problems that we have at the moment. And then translations, as I mentioned before, that's really good for that. And the final kind of really good point about it is accountable and tracked. So if I make a change to the Gitbook and it's a malicious thing and something that's not useful to the community, then my GitHub account is linked to that change. So it's very, very easy to find people who do any malicious activity and then obviously remove them from the process, and you can identify it. And because it's kind of like, it has that Git history, it's much easier to kind of go through and see how things change over time, which is a real nice benefit of this. So with this tool in mind, if we were thinking about adopting it, then I think the first step would be for IOHK to adopt the Gitbook as a tool to manage resources themselves. And the kind of key problems that would solve is it would solve the single resource location problem. So it'd have all the benefits mentioned earlier of the clarity and simplicity, the simple management, and that consistency. It would help prevent the information loss because now it's all in one place and it always gets updated in that place. So now the social posts and messages and emails, any key information would be shared in there and you wouldn't lose any of it. And then finally, it's also better for the integration, as I mentioned before. So it's much easier and you have different optionality for how you want to integrate into the community tools or just link towards it. So people can start to consume that resources in the way they like to and improve it or add suggestions in their own kind of tooling. And then the next kind of step that would make a lot of sense for this solution would be to introduce trusted community members, which it could, as I mentioned before, happen very, very quickly. So it's completely up to IOHK on how fast that could happen. And the key problems of introducing community would solve then you'd start to have the distributed management, which would help to spread out that kind of responsibility for managing the resources, so IOHK is in less of a burden. And the second thing is just going to be faster learning. By having IOHK and the community working on this together, it's going to help with what is, learning what is required to manage these resources in a distributed way. What will actually inform improvements to the tooling and process over time. So we actually know what is it when we do want to have this kind of perfect solution, what might actually look like. Which takes us to what is that ideal future. So I think the key next kind of steps, once you kind of have maybe a Gitbook implementation being used, is how are we going to learn about what's needed. So if the IOHK and the community are managing the resources, that will provide a lot of experience on what governance and tools work well. We can also trial tools such as canny.io to experiment with different ways to get more regular feedback from the community to manage the resources. Ultimately, we want to determine what is effective or not. And then finally, with that experience, we can also look at different budgeting approaches, like say bounties, hourly rates, part-time work. What is the most effective thing, like to actually financially provide financial resources to maintaining those resources? And once we kind of get that education, we can start to look towards that longer term kind of solution. So we can, with that kind of experience, one thing that could be really beneficial is if we could encourage existing tools like Gitbook to integrate identity and governance functionality with Atala Prism. Now that would be an ideal solution and situation because it would help prevent us from reinventing the wheel and spending the treasury money on tooling that we don't need to make if there's existing tools that are already interested in integrating the identity solutions and things that would take this to the next step and requirements that we have for having this completely distributed. And then on from that, if there was no existing tools that want to integrate the target ecosystem, that's absolutely fine, because then the community in IOHK would be well informed on what type of tooling, governance, and budgeting is needed for this custom solution. So we'd be starting from a much stronger base of information and knowledge on exactly what we want. So coming to the finale, we've made a beta demo for this, so you can have a look on resources.projectcatalyst.org. So if you want to have a look at an example of taking what we've currently got for the resources and some of the Google Docs that IOHK has had and porting those into a Git book to kind of gauge how that structure could look like and see how it makes it a lot easier to kind of see all the different moving parts. And from that, I think if most people may have heard of Catalyst School, and what they help with is learning about and getting involved with Project Catalyst. And I believe a Gitbook repository for the Project Catalyst stuff could be hosted by either IOHK or Catalyst School as a really great place to maintain these resources if this is the solution we kind of choose to move forward with. And now moving on to feedback from the tools and the information you found in the slides and what I've recommended with Gitbook, it'd be great to know what your thoughts are. Like, is there any tool that you think we've missed out? Do you have any concerns? Is there something you want to be involved with, like what, on how it can be managed? If you follow that forms link, which is going to be posted below, then what we can do is we're going to take that information and then consolidate it and then provide that to a discussion that we want to have with IOG on suggesting this kind of updated approach to how to manage resources, and then how we can slowly kind of move towards this distributed management over time. And that's it for now. So thanks a lot for watching this and sharing. And yeah, it'd be great to get some feedback, and I will catch you guys soon. So thank you very much.